We are well below critical mass in certain areas, and I think President Trump is right to put pressure on to say to the government, we need to do better.
Now, the Times reports tonight that President Trump's administration wants Britain to raise its defence spending by tens of billions of pounds to set an example to other European allies. Pentagon chiefs are reported to have told their British counterparts that the US president would be happier if the UK increased its budget so that it hits 3% of GDP by the end of this Parliament, 2029, years earlier than planned. Well, Major General Tim Cross is a former British Army officer. Good evening to you, Major General Cross.
Good evening. Hi, Carol.
We've known for a while that President Trump wants its European and British allies to spend more. It does seem to be ramping up the pressure.
Yeah, I think he does. He's not the first president, of course, to have said this. There have been a lot of presidents over probably a couple of decades, really, who've expected Europe to spend more. The UK has been one of the largest spenders within Nato. But it's not that long ago. I mean, certainly during my service, we were spending 5-6% of GDP on defence. I mean, they were different days, of course. But we have cut back a lot in the last couple of decades. And we are well below critical mass in certain areas. And I think President Trump is right to put pressure on to say to the government, we need to do better. Now, you know, Prime Minister and the Cabinet and the Treasury and all the other key players here, of course, have got huge problems and other pressures in all sorts of other areas of government. But we know that the world is, you know, it is always a dangerous place. In one sense, there's nothing new about that. But what's been going on in Ukraine and elsewhere, the government have decided we do need to spend more on defence. And I personally think that the 2027 deadline for 2.5% and the sort of mid-2030s for 3% was always too slow. So I have a problem with the pressure being put on by the president.
Yeah, I mean, the government's talking, as you say there, about getting to 2.5% by 2027. As you also refer to, there is huge financial pressures on the government. But we've got this big strategic defence review, which we're expecting fairly shortly. Do you think that as a result of that, the British government could be forced anyway to up its spending? Because it seems like barely a day goes past when someone in the military or who's recently left the military warns of the gaping hole in our defence forces, or gaping holes.
Yeah. Well, I think the SDR, there's been a lot of speculation about when it's coming out, what it's going to happen, you know, what it's going to include and so forth. The latest, my understanding, the latest is it's going to come out relatively soon. I mean, I've heard 3 weeks, for example, being quoted. What it will include, of course, at this stage, we don't know. And there is some suggestion that there will be follow-up work going on beyond this. General Richard Barron's, who I know, has been involved in this. But I think it will lay out, a strategic analysis. Will it force the government to spend more money? No, I don't think it will force it, but it will certainly show, I hope, a really good analysis, a strategic analysis of the state of play today. What are the pressures? What are the capabilities that we need to have in order to, and never forget that defense is primarily about deterrence. It's about trying to stop conflict. A lot of people running around saying we're going to be at war with Russia in the next 2, 3, 5 years. If I'm honest, I'm not one of those people. But nonetheless, you do need to deter war. And to do that, you need to have what we call fighting power in place. You need to have the physical component of fighting power, the stuff, the airplanes, the ships, the army regiments, the ammunition, in particular, the sustainability to enable you to fight. And that's a key issue. And a lot of people quite rightly have raised the issue that if we were to be sucked into a high intensity war fight in the next few years, we would not be able to sustain it for very long.
Just finally, and just very briefly, if you could, Major General, I mean, the Prime Minister's got a huge amount of pressures on him. We know that there's lots of pressures on the budget. Do you think part of the problem is that spending more on defence just hasn't really captured the public imagination? The public would much rather the money was spent on stopping the boats, keeping their household bills down, or improving their local hospital.
Yeah, that's true. But what we're talking about here is strategic, morally courageous leadership. I mean, being Prime Minister and member of a cabinet does not mean following the whims of the electorate every 5 minutes. And sadly, we live in a sort of celebrity culture and a news media that's on the rounds for 24 hours a day and immediate pressures. We need people who can stand above all of that and look out and say we need to make some key strategic decisions because of the state of play within the world. So, of course, the average person in the street is not that interested in anything other than the effect on their lives of things like the NHS, education, and so on. And that's perfectly understandable. But that's, being a politician and being a member of the cabinet, the prime minister, and so on is about strategic leadership, about morally courageous leadership, standing up and saying to people, this is the reality, these are our priorities, this is what we have to deliver. And you can't, it's no good saying everything is a priority because it can't possibly be. You just have to decide what those priorities are.
Major General Tim Cross, former British Army officer. Great to speak to you. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Do stay.
But clearly the American administration is very much involved, closely coordinating with European colleagues and of course Ukraine, and I think that is very positive.
Mr. President, comment se passent les négociations?
Well, the talks may happen at some level, depending on who comes to Istanbul. The talks are already taking place behind the scenes on prisoner exchanges, on trying to understand each other's positions. There were previous talks, let's recall, about the navigation in the Black Sea and the grain deal. But I think right now Putin has started this diplomatic ping-pong where the combined position of Ukraine, Europe, the coalition of the willing, and the United States was to impose an unconditional ceasefire. And Putin basically rejected this idea, proposing an alternative offer, which is to have negotiations in Istanbul on the 15th of May. So what this bilateral meeting could look like, Russians could present their demands, Ukraine may reject these demands, and this will be the end of it. There could also be a high-level meeting between Ukrainian president, the president of Turkey, and maybe Donald Trump, if he decides to stop in Istanbul. And they could discuss wider issues, security in the Black Sea. They could discuss perhaps common position on pushing Russia to actually agree to stop the war and take a negotiation process in earnest and in good faith.
Шановні колеги, прес-брифінг президента України Володимира Зеленського, заява президента України.
Доброго дня. Якщо Путін дійсно готовий не тільки в медіа, а в реальному житті зустрічатись, і тоді на рівні лідерів ми зробимо все, щоб домовитись про припинення вогню. Бо саме з ним я повинен домовлятись про припинення вогню. Бо тільки він це вирішить.
There are two questions that President Zelensky himself said he is ready to talk with President Putin. One is ceasefire. In order to have any serious negotiations, the hostilities have to stop. And the second one is if Russia is indeed willing to negotiate, they should prove it. There is no trust to Russia because all the previous commitments they violated. So what could be the expression of this trust is actually return of all Ukrainian war prisoners, civilian prisoners, and Ukrainian children that were deported from eastern part of Ukraine into Russia. This should be a signal, this humanitarian gesture should be a signal that Russia wants peace.
Добрый вечер, или уже, наверное, доброй ночи всех. Предлагаем киевским властям возобновить переговоры, прерванные ими в конце 2022 года. Возобновить прямые переговоры, причем, подчеркну, без всяких предварительных условий. Начать предлагаем без промедления уже в следующий четверг, 15 мая, в Стамбуле, там, где они проводились ранее и там, где они были прерваны.
It is not clear if Trump will actually exercise peace through strength. It is clear that he is losing patience with Putin, and it is clear that he believes that Putin wants too much. How will that manifest itself in action? We don't know, because up to now, Trump has not imposed a single pressure point on Russia.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. It's a big day. Thursday's meeting with Russia and Ukraine is very important. I was very insistent that that meeting take place. I think good things can come out of that meeting.
Putin wants to destroy Ukraine as an independent state. Putin wants to push United States and NATO out of Eastern Europe all the way to the borders of 1997. Putin wants Europe to take his right to the sphere of influence in Eastern Europe again seriously. None of these conditions can be met.